In the last few weeks, there were unlawful measures taken against Russia by a number of Western countries to freeze Russian assets. By doing this, the collective West has undermined the reliability of their currencies.
And with that statement, Putin followed up with basically saying, from this point on, unfriendly countries are going to have to pay for Russian gas in rubles. Now, of course, there is going to be a collective ass-puckering from the standpoint of the West. But as I had mentioned, I think maybe weeks ago, why on earth does the United States and Europe believe that they will be able to take unilateral moves without there being a response? Meaning, if the pressure point from the standpoint of Europe is, we're willing to put every sanction imaginable upon Russia to enact this economic war to utterly and entirely destroy the Russian economy. Except for gas, because we need gas. Gas is something we need. We're already cold, we're already shivering, we're already paying a ton of money for gas. Gas prices have been going through the roof. We don't want to touch the issue of gas. But everything else, I'm going to put the hammer of God on Moscow. My thought was, if that's going to be your take, why do you believe that Russia wouldn't respond in the very particular areas to which you are vulnerable? Gas, meaning you need energy, which is clear as day, considering that's the aspect that you don't necessarily want to touch. Well, Russia is touching it. Not to mention this notion of wheat, or for that matter, fertilizer. Again, these are things that the Russian economy is basically plugged into the global space. Trying to extricate them from that space will have all sorts of issues of pain. And a very specific point, though, this goes beyond just trolling. This is just good goddamn sense. And I would even go so far as to say, not just good sense, required. Any sovereign nation will do exactly what he did. And I'm going to explain why Russia is doing this. Yes, it shores up the ruble in one sense, which again, there was economic war against it. They were basically trying to collapse the currency and whatnot. No, that didn't necessarily happen. And this, one of the moves that Russia is basically taking to shore up its economy. This is really interesting. I mean, because what started off as this kind of economic war that was waged against Russia in this case is becoming this kind of weird sanctions war, or in this very specific case, an energy war. And that is not a war that Europe, or for that matter, the US is any position to deal with. If you haven't been hearing the things that have been coming out of Europe from the standpoint of Germany or the economy or the European states and the amount of oil that they use, like 4 million barrels a day. I think the US is 700,000. Clearly, there is a dramatic difference in the requirements of oil for, let's say, Europe versus the United States. But in this very specific case, the US has been running around the globe, even going to Maduro, the guy who they tried to have whacked just a year ago to try to get oil, even trying to speed up the JCPOA in spite of Iran striking a base in Iraq that belongs to Israel. This gets across the level of desperation that they are, or that the US and that Europe has for oil, and to replace Russian gas supplies. Well, in this very specific case, the gas that Europe is going to get, if it's going to get it at all, will be paid in rubles. Welcome to the soapbox. My name is Jamarl Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, please like, share, and of course, subscribe. This video is not necessarily going to be long, but I definitely want to talk about this particular issue because I thought this was fantastic. And yeah, it's what you would expect Putin to do in this situation. And it makes all the rational sense in the world, considering what the West was basically doing. You have the West that basically provokes a crisis in Ukraine. After provoking a crisis in Ukraine by literally expanding a hostile military organization that shouldn't even exist to the borders of Russia, and then going further in 2014 and knocking over a government in basically a coup, getting rid of the elected president of that country. And with that coup government being radically Russophobic, in some cases sympathetic to Nazis, with Nazis all throughout, or neo-Nazis all throughout the military, basically being instantiated into the Ukrainian military. Yeah, that's going to be an issue, to put it mildly. And in this case, at the point where Russia responds, all of these European nations all of a sudden freak out and pass sanctions in order to create this economic war to do what they couldn't necessarily do militarily. And let's be honest, to do what they've been doing for the last 30, 40 years since the fall of the Soviet Union. Basically, trying to undermine and break up, or at the very least, let's say, get Russia out of its own orbit and out of its own best interests into something that the West prefers. Well, in this very specific case, Putin's responding to the economic warfare that was waged against his country. What the West did with some of those sanctions is astonishing, actually, when you think about it. And his point about undermining the Western financial system, yeah. I mean, think about it for the moment. Afghanistan falls, and the United States steals $9 billion that belongs to the Afghani government. In this case, the Taliban government, since the Taliban has basically taken over Afghanistan. Joe Biden didn't want to look as if he was giving his former enemy money. And so he chooses to just keep the cash and leaves Afghans on the streets literally starving to death. I think it's like 90% of the country is basically food insecure or in starvation mode. That's just one country. Venezuela, same thing. Stole the money from Venezuela. And in this very specific situation, that's basically what they did to Russia. When they passed those sanctions at the point where Russia invaded Ukraine, well, many of those sanctions were hitting directly on Russian banks. Well, Russia, like other countries, often have reserves in other denominated currencies. So they may have dollars, they may have euros, they may have et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What happens when those other governments decide we're not going to exchange those currencies anymore? Meaning, the money that you have denominated in those currencies, yeah, you're not going to get that back. We're just going to keep that. We're just going to freeze that. Your central bank is not going to access the reserves that you basically have been saving up. That's effectively stealing money that the Russian government had basically saved up, forcing, or at the very least trying to force, a default. That was one of the elements that was basically being used. Now, again, I want to point back to this notion that why on earth do you believe that you're going to be able to take all of these moves in a country the size of Russia that is so plugged into the global economy? Things like what? Wheat production, things like gas, like especially gas from that standpoint. But also things like neon, things like, let's say, minerals and those type of things that go into creating these kind of electronics that we need. Why on earth do you believe you're going to take certain unilateral action and that stuff? A, it's not going to blow back on your communities or your country first, which it is. There's going to be a war of recession as a result of them doing this and then going after China if they so choose to continue that path. But on top of that, the moves that Russia would make in compensation for what you were doing and in punitive response for what you're doing. This is not the year 2000, where the United States is a unipolar power and everybody else is just something else. You have other spheres of influence and power, and with this being the global economy, there's a certain level of, let's say, window of what's the word I'm looking for? Of vulnerability. That's what I want to get to. A window of vulnerability that all of these countries have on some level, because all of these countries are trading with each other and need certain things that the other countries provide. In this very specific case, gas. Gas. The foreign currency reserve, this is Fortune.com. Russia's central bank has been stockpiling foreign reserves ever since Russia last invaded Ukraine when President Putin annexed Crimea in 2014. That's not an invasion. Crimea decided to leave. Crimea, again, repeat that, decided to leave. I know the U.S. narrative of this is Russia just strong armed and ripped Crimea away. Khrushchev gave Crimea over, first point, when they were part of the Soviet Union, and the thought was that all of us are part of the same union, not an issue. They could take it, they could administrate it, have more, or it's closer, in that case, meaning they could have more administrative functionality with it. No issue. Nobody at that point foreseen or foresaw the Soviet Union collapsing, not even the United States foresaw the Soviet Union collapsing. My point is, at the point where the coup government took over, and you basically had a Russophobic, far-right, neo-Nazi sympathetic government running the country, then yeah, ethnic Russian Ukrainians decided it is time for us to leave. And with a referendum where over 90% participated and over 90% voted to leave, they left. That is not the same thing as an invasion, nor is that the same thing as strong arming a country. What's taking place now is an invasion. The Crimea was not. Russia's central, let's keep going. Russia's holding of foreign currency and gold have almost doubled, ballooning 630 billion today from 368 billion 7 years ago. Building foreign reserves could have been a way for the Kremlin to guard Russia's economy against sanctions by giving the central bank more ammunition to protect the value of the ruble. The ruble lost half of its value against the US dollar after the annexation of the Crimea, right here. Except it turns out that Russian foreign reserve strategy had a major flaw. About half of the money was held overseas in foreign banks, and now Russia can't get to it. On Monday, the US, Japan, and the European Union barred Russia's central bank from tapping into billions of foreign reserves Moscow had been saving in their banks. Basically, they stole the money to try to force a default. So, Putin's response, it makes no sense for us to pay you in dollars or yen, or in this case, euros. So we're not. Meaning, if you want to get our gas, when you pay us, you will pay us in rubles. It is no point for us to take your currency in euros or dollars or something else. If you indeed are going to give it to us, since you are not giving us that money back, meaning you're freezing our reserves. Why on earth would we take more of your currency from you if you're going to freeze our reserves? How can we trust that we're going to be able to get the value from that currency when we need to exchange that currency? Why is that not good sense? Meaning, if you were in his space, pick a country, random country, and the other countries that you're dealing with has decided, yes, we need your oil, so we definitely want to trade with you, your gas, I'm sorry. So we definitely want to trade with you. We need your gas. And we'll pay you in a currency that we are basically never going to give you the money back for. So wait, you're paying us, but not paying us? Yes, that is exactly what we prefer to do. So what is your response going to be? Well, yeah, no, we're not going to allow you to pay us in a currency where we can't necessarily reap the value from. So you will pay us in our own currency. You will pay us in rubles. Or you just won't get the gas. The dirty secret that it seems counterintuitive, but I guess makes sense in a certain logic, is that despite Russia and Ukraine being at war, Ukraine is still collecting the transit fees for the Russian gas that's being ported to Europe. Let me repeat that. I was shocked by this myself. Despite the war taking place, Russia is still fulfilling its gas obligations. Despite the weapons, the money that Europe is basically dumping in, despite the economic sanctions that Europe has been heaping on Russia and the United States and Japan, Russia is still fulfilling its gas obligations. And that gas obligations is being ported through transit pipes going through Ukraine, that Ukraine reaps money from that transit. If you remember, the issue with Nord Stream 2 from the standpoint of the United States and Ukraine was that basically you can circumvent going through Ukraine, which they did not necessarily want because they weren't going to be able to reap the billions of dollars in those transit fees. That was one of the rationales to try to get Nord Stream 2 basically shut down, despite the fact it wasn't in German interest in the least. But I guess my point is, Russia is still delivering on its obligations. And from their standpoint, okay, we'll continue to deliver these obligations. You need the gas, we need the money. Fair enough. We will be taking rubles from here on out. Now, Europe can complain, they can bitch, they can moan, they can dance, they can do the jerk, they can do whatever they want. At the end of the day, do you want the gas? Yay or nay? And do you have something else to replace the supply of gas if you don't get it from us? And that answer is yet. No. The answer is no. I mean, the U.S. has been calling Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia didn't even pick up the phone. And at this point, there's these kind of military assistance that the U.S. has been given from the standpoint of Yemen and everything else to try to, I guess, sweeten them to loosen the pipes of the oil. They may or may not do that. I doubt they will, for the reason I'll explain after. They've tried to go through Qatar to get them to release more oil. Fact of the matter is, it's just not enough to replace the amount that they were getting of gas that they were getting from Russia. And even going to Venezuela and Iran, trying to speed up the JCPOA and get that deal over with so they can get their hands on that energy. Or for that matter, in Venezuela, they try to sweep Maduro to get their hands on that. Considering they tried to murder Maduro and consider they just murdered Soleimani a few years ago, we'll see how that turns out. I do know Iran wants to loosen up the sanctions on its own economy, so we'll see. But up to this point, they haven't necessarily had a deal, but it seems that the U.S. is trying to expedite that deal in order to get their hands on those reserves. The point I'm making here is the level of desperation that Europe and the U.S. is dealing with in trying to find some way to replace Russian gas. And considering they have not articulated how they plan to do that, Russia doing this seems to have them over a barrel. We'll see. Europe is going to complain. They're going to bitch. They're going to moan. They're going to say, hey, you're trying to circumvent our sanctions. No duh. They find your sanctions. I mean, your sanctions are only legitimate to you. They're only legitimate to you. The object of those sanctions that you're basically aiming them at, don't see them as legitimate. And not just not see them as legitimate, see it as you provoked this crisis in the first place. And on top of provoking it, basically set a context to basically allow what is taking place right now. The West, contrary to its own self-conception of itself, only makes up a small fraction of the globe. Even this talk about Russia being isolated and everything else. India, 1.5 billion people. China, 1.3 billion people. You go to South America and the BRIC nations. Yeah, that is not the same thing as entirely being isolated in the way that they're talking about it. You might be isolated from the West, but there's a big world out there. My point is, if Europe and the United States and Japan, I don't know Japan's logistics, but from the standpoint of Europe and the US, if they want access to Russian supplies of gas, they will be paying for that in rubles. And I strongly suspect that it's not just going to be gas. They'll probably even move it over to other items associated with non-friendly nations. Again, why would I take money from you if there is no way for me to extract the value of that when I'm trying to extract the value of that? You've barred my banks. You've blocked us off. So why would I take your currency? Your currency is basically a dead letter. We want rubles. Rubles is what has value in this country. Rubles is what we need. Rubles is what you will pay us in if you indeed want the gas. Now, this is going to create contract disputes, clearly. And in the context of those contract disputes, will Europe be able to basically go without getting gas until the contract disputes are resolved? Who knows? At the end of the day, the Russian ruble went up against the dollar for obvious reasons. This is basically their way of trying to shore up their currency. And I suspect the energy markets are looking at this, thinking to themselves, how is Europe going to say no? How are they going to say no? It's a vital resource that they can't do without, nor can they find a replacement for. I could be wrong, but we'll see. I mean, at the end of the day, my point is, the move that Putin is making here is a rational, pragmatic move. And it's a rational, pragmatic move that any leader of any sovereign nation that is trying to shore up their currency in the face of a withering economic conflict or economic war would take. It's just rational action. Like, share, and of course, subscribe. Thanks, everyone.